Welcome to the past unveiled, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We now begin with Story 1. How paperwork held an empire together. Story 1, Section 1. The Foundations of Paper Rule. In the heart of ancient Persia, amid the dusty splendor of the highlands and the scorching plains, an empire rose not on chariots or conquests alone, but on the quiet, careful work of archivists. You might imagine history's great empires as being carved by swords and spears. But here, in Persepolis, capital of the Achaemenid Empire, there is another sound: the soft pressing of styluses into clay, the repetitive tapping of scribes annotating grain deliveries, and the dry rustle of reed pens over papyrus. This is the sound of the ancient Persian bureaucracy, an institution so thorough and systematic that its records would survive for millennia. The humble beginnings of an empire's record-keeping. When Cyrus the Great founded the Achaemenid Empire in the 6th century BCE, he unified a vast stretch of land from Anatolia to the Indus Valley. But conquest was just the start. To manage such a sprawling, culturally diverse empire required something more enduring than military might. It required records. The early administration leaned heavily on the record-keeping traditions of Elam, Babylon, and Assyria. In fact, much of the bureaucratic language used in the early Achaemenid period, particularly in Persepolis, was Elamite, a now extinct language with a long bureaucratic pedigree. Under Darius I.R. 522–486 BCE, the system became formalized. At Persepolis, a city built as a ceremonial capital, a massive administrative complex grew. It wasn't just palaces and throne rooms. Beneath its grand facades ran the veins of empire: archives. These archives, known today as the Persepolis Fortification Tablets and the Persepolis Treasury Tablets, were no great secret. They were filed carefully, stacked in storage rooms, sorted by function. Most were written on clay tablets using cuneiform script in Elamite. Some were in Aramaic or Old Persian. There were thousands of them. What do these tablets tell us? Everything. The world in a tablet. You might think of an ancient document as a dusty list of taxes or a royal edict, but these were far more granular. These were ledgers of barley rations distributed to temple workers, travel permits for royal envoys, tallies of livestock moved from one province to another, laborer payments, orders for beer. It was mundane. It was repetitive. It was absolutely vital. The archivists of Persepolis didn't rule. They didn't fight. But they kept the system from falling apart. Without them, there would be no certainty of how much food to send to workers during harvest season, or which governor was owed tribute. Each tablet was a node in a network of control. To be clear, most of these scribes were not highborn. Many were slaves or state dependents, people assigned to clerical tasks for life. Their world was small. The confines of the record room, the same stylus strokes repeated day after day. And yet, their work connected the distant provinces of the empire. They didn't just record data, they categorized it. A shipment of dates might be logged by quantity, quality, origin, and recipient. A laborer's travel document might include their name, work details, number of accompanying animals, and the specific route authorized. We know all this today because, in a twist of history, these tablets weren't destroyed. They were forgotten. The accidental time capsule. In 330 BCE, When Alexander the Great conquered Persepolis, the city was partially burned, perhaps in a drunken act of vengeance, perhaps as a political statement. But the fire never reached the archives. Instead, the fall of the Achaemenids led to administrative disuse. The rooms were sealed, collapsed, and buried in silt. And so, for more than 2,000 years, the record-keeping heart of a dead empire lay dormant beneath the ruins. In 1933, archaeologists from the University of Chicago began excavating Persepolis. What they found was not treasure in the traditional sense, no golden tombs, no royal jewels, but tens of thousands of clay tablets. It was bureaucratic gold. The Persepolis Fortification Archive, comprising over 30,000 tablets and fragments, offers the most detailed picture of daily administration in an ancient empire anywhere in the world. And though the translation process has been slow and painstaking, because Elamite remains only partially understood, every tablet reveals another dull, beautiful detail of how empires sustain themselves. Take, for instance, Tablet PF 1947. It lists the disbursement of wine to workers engaged in building a wall near the Hall of 100 Columns. The entry notes the worker category, their duration of service, and the precise amount of wine given as compensation measured in karu, an Achaemenid unit. Not fascinating, not thrilling. Exactly. But it's real. This is the ancient world, not as seen through war and glory, but through labor, logistics, and management. Paperwork is power. The real power of the Achaemenid bureaucracy wasn't merely in the recording, it was in the predictability. By standardizing pay, rations, and responsibilities across vast distances, the empire imposed order on chaos. A worker in Bactria, modern Afghanistan, could receive the same barley ration for the same labor as one in Susa, modern Iran. A satrap in Lydia could submit reports using forms mirrored by his counterpart in Arachosia. This is how the Achaemenid Empire, one of the largest in history, remained intact for over 2 centuries, not by sheer force, but by documentation. And it wasn't just economic control. Religion, too, was managed through paperwork. Temples had to account for their income and outlays. Fire sanctuaries submitted grain requests. Priests received allocations based on bureaucratic classification. Even spiritual life became a matter of balance sheets. One might say that in Persia, even the gods needed accountants. So now, as you settle into rest, picture not a battlefield but a quiet chamber lit by oil lamps. Picture a man hunched over a clay tablet, stylus in hand, recording yet another shipment of dried figs to the storehouse of Susa. He sighs, adjusts his posture, and dips the stylus again. And ask yourself, how did a system so meticulous survive war, rebellion, and time itself, only to be forgotten for 2,000 years? When you last left the archives of Persepolis, you stood quietly in the shadow of forgotten shelves, where clay tablets bore the weight of an empire's management. Now, let us open the door just a bit wider and step inside, not into the minds of kings or generals, but into the daily lives of those who wrote the empire into existence, one line at a time. In this section, we'll meet the scribes of the Achaemenid bureaucracy. They were not famous. Their names rarely made it into chronicles, but they were indispensable. Their task: to translate the sprawling realities of ancient Persian society, its people, its taxes, its food and labor, into numbers, language, and enduring administrative form. Who were the scribes? In the Achaemenid Empire, scribes were part of a rigid and structured administrative hierarchy. Some were born into scribal families. Others were trained from youth to serve the empire in its various provinces. Most were men, though records suggest that women also played roles in record-keeping, particularly in temple administration. Scribes were usually multilingual, or at least proficient in reading and copying multiple languages. Why? Because the empire itself spoke in many tongues. The three official languages used in the archives of Persepolis were Elamite, Old Persian, and Aramaic. Elamite, used for the majority of fortification tablets. It had a long bureaucratic history and was perhaps chosen for its administrative familiarity. Old Persian, reserved for royal inscriptions and monumental declarations, rarely used in daily paperwork. Aramaic, the lingua franca of the empire, especially useful for communication across regions. Scribes didn't just write, they copied, translated, edited, and cataloged. They maintained controlled terminology and formatting. Each word, line, and seal mattered. An error could mean unpaid wages, incorrect rations, or, in the worst cases, serious punishment. Yet their world was not dramatic. Their day began early. They worked under overseers, often in dimly lit rooms. Clay was rolled, styluses were cut to precise sizes, and tablets were either dried in the sun or baked, depending on their intended permanence. What they created wasn't meant to last forever. It was meant to be functional. And yet it has lasted. A day in the life of an imperial scribe. Imagine this. You are a middle-tier scribe named Paruzana, stationed at the Persepolis Treasury Office around 498 BCE. Your workspace is narrow. You sit cross-legged with several unmarked clay tablets in front of you, a stylus made of reed, and a simple ledger that logs the date and category of each tablet. First, you check a delivery of barley sacks. The warehouse steward has submitted a verbal report. You tally the sacks. You press your stylus into the soft clay and record. 10 karu barley delivered by Barnusha, overseer of the royal granary, 18th month of Darius, year 24, distributed to laborers on the Northern Wall project. Next, you mark your seal impression on the edge of the tablet. You are not of noble status, but your seal signifies authorization. The tablet is now part of the official record. And then you continue to the next. This repetition may sound tedious, but within its patterns lies power. Each record ensures accountability. Each name ties a person to a system. Each quantity is part of the food chain that stretches across an empire. Scribes like Paruzana were not exempt from oversight. Auditors, often higher-ranking bureaucrats, would randomly inspect entries for accuracy. Discrepancies led to investigation. Sometimes it was just a simple miscount. Other times it led to severe consequences, especially if theft or fraud was suspected. But for most scribes, the key to survival was consistency. A scribe who recorded 300 barley sacks for 1 week was expected to get the numbers right the next week, too. The logistics of literacy. Literacy in the Achaemenid Empire was not widespread. Reading and writing were specialized skills, and training took years. The scribes underwent formal apprenticeships, most likely in palace schools or temple precincts. But what did literacy mean in this context? Unlike modern literacy, which implies fluency across many types of texts, Achaemenid literacy was often functional. A scribe might learn to write lists and tallies without necessarily understanding royal inscriptions or poetry. It was job-specific. There were also different types of scribes. Accounting scribes, who focused on numerical tallies and commodity tracking. Administrative scribes, who managed appointments, personnel, and logistics. Religious scribes, who worked in temple registries and managed sacred allocations. Military scribes, who tracked troop movement, rations, and conscription lists. Each had their own templates, lexicons, and protocols. What unified them all was formality. The structure of each tablet followed a consistent layout: date, sender, subject, quantity, and recipient. Deviating from this pattern was not just discouraged, it was dangerous. The bureaucracy that touched every life. What made this system extraordinary was its reach. A farmer working in a remote village might never meet a scribe, but his work would be logged by one. His barley, if sent as tax, would be counted. His oxen, if borrowed by a state labor project, would be tagged, returned, and recorded. Even in their absence, people were present on paper. Take, for example, the allocation tablet's small clay records that document rations given to laborers. A single tablet might list 10 workers, their tribal affiliations, and the amount of beer, grain, or wine they received for 2 days of work. This wasn't charity. It was systemic support, structured and bound by forms. The empire gave, but only if the ledgers confirmed the right to give. These allocations reveal something else, too: the degree to which non-Persian populations were integrated into the administrative machinery. Names on tablets reflect people from Media, Elam, Babylonia, Egypt, even India. This was a multi-ethnic empire held together not just by law or language but by bureaucracy. And yet, for all its reach and detail, the system relied on the fallibility of human hands. The scribe's burden. There were mistakes. Sometimes scribes misrecorded names or confused units. Occasionally, a tablet would need to be corrected. This led to cross-referencing systems, a kind of early auditing. But errors could cost lives or at least livelihoods. If a laborer's rations were misrecorded, their family might go hungry. If a governor's tribute was inaccurately logged, it could trigger investigations from the central court. Some scribes attempted to protect themselves with seals, personal markers that said, "This is my work, I take responsibility." Seals were often carved with unique symbols: animals, stars, mythical beasts. A lost seal could be disastrous. Stolen seals were sometimes used to forge entries, creating chaos in the administrative chain. So while scribes lived bureaucratic lives, they also lived in fear, not of battle but of blame. This fear was not unfounded. In one account, suggested by Babylonian parallels, scribes who consistently failed their duties could be demoted, fined, or publicly punished. While Achaemenid legal tablets are rare, it's likely that incompetence in record-keeping could be treated as a serious offense, especially if it affected taxation or royal provisions. Still, the system endured. Scribes trained new scribes. Their methods were duplicated across satrapies. The language evolved, but the function remained unchanged. A bureaucratic web. The archivists at Persepolis didn't work alone. Their data flowed to and from satraps, regional governors appointed by the king. These satraps had their own bureaucracies. Reports were consolidated, filtered, and dispatched toward the central offices in Persepolis and Susa. Communication was often physical. Messengers carried tablets wrapped in cloth. In some cases, royal couriers on the royal road could move dispatches hundreds of kilometers in just days. The result: a surprisingly efficient information network for the ancient world. This administrative architecture made decision-making possible at the top levels of government. A king could approve tax remission in one province while authorizing military supply increases in another, but only if the information reached him, clean and complete. This invisible web, the scribes, seals, messages, and ledgers, was what made empire possible. Not gods, not generals. Scribes. And so, as you drift into silence, think of those who lived their lives repeating the same motions every day, who pressed words into clay not to be remembered, but so that the world wouldn't forget to function. And ask yourself, what kind of civilization are we, if we are only as strong as our paperwork? You've wandered through the archives of Persepolis, sat among the scribes, and followed the flow of paperwork that stitched together an empire. Now, in this final section, we pull back and observe the full organism, the system, not just the scribes, but the layers upon layers of clerical control, verification, and supervision that formed the Achaemenid bureaucracy. This is where all those clay tablets and quiet scribes became something larger. This is the boring, magnificent machine that kept the Achaemenid Empire alive long after wars were won or lost. The satrapies, provinces by the numbers. At the heart of the Persian administrative system was the satrapy, a province governed by a satrap, or governor. These satraps held considerable power but were firmly embedded in the bureaucracy. They were expected to submit detailed annual reports to the royal court, outlining the tribute collected, expenditures made, and economic conditions in their province. There were around 20 to 30 satrapies at any given time, covering territories that today include Turkey, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, parts of Central Asia, and even Northwest India. Each satrapy had a recording office responsible for copying and transmitting documents, an auditing office to cross-verify reports from local sub-governors and village administrators, a treasury staffed by accountants to record tribute and expenses. And yes, these functions were staffed by scribes. When Herodotus wrote about the empire, he noted the immense tribute that flowed into the king's coffers, but he didn't see the ledger behind the loot. He saw the results, not the forms. Satraps had to submit ledgers in standardized formats. Imagine it: grain measured in karu, silver in shekels, livestock by head count, all broken down by district, season, and collection method. Each entry bore seals, signatures, or stylus marks denoting its approval chain. To the modern reader, it might look like a glorified Excel spreadsheet in clay, but it was advanced, a hierarchical, federated reporting system tied directly to central authority. The role of auditors, fear in clay form. To ensure honesty, or at least predictable dishonesty, the empire employed royal auditors. These agents, appointed directly by the king, had the authority to travel to satrapies unannounced and review the accounts. They often operated in pairs or small teams and had access to central archives for comparison. If discrepancies arose, a multi-step verification process could follow. Local document comparison, checking district records against satrap reports. Personnel interviews, especially with lower-tier scribes or warehouse workers. Tribunal review, possibly conducted in the satrapal court. And finally, if deceit or incompetence was proven, punishment. While few detailed records of specific disciplinary actions survive, Babylonian sources and later Seleucid practices that inherited Persian methods suggest that administrative misconduct could lead to fines, removal from post, public humiliation, or in rare cases, execution, especially if tax shortfalls were involved. Thus, the boring scribal job came with very real consequences. The stakes of a single misfiled document could ripple across an entire district. The Treasury Tablets, Empire in Microcosm. The Persepolis Treasury Tablets, a smaller archive than the fortification set, reveal a focused look at labor and payment records within the palace economy. They detail the number of workers assigned to various construction and ceremonial projects, the types of rations issued, seasonal fluctuations in labor supply, women's and children's participation in palace labor forces. Yes, even gendered labor was bureaucratically managed. These tablets tell us about women named Erdabama and Parmaces, elite administrators who controlled workforces and properties. Erdabama managed hundreds of workers and controlled estates across several provinces. Her name appears repeatedly, showing how elite women could thrive inside a bureaucratic system that respected seal authority and documented merit. The empire didn't just acknowledge social hierarchy, it codified it. Workers were categorized into class and rank. Kurtash, dependent laborers, not exactly slaves but bound to state service. Specialists, like stonemasons or goldsmiths, often paid higher rations. Overseers, literate administrators responsible for managing teams. Each person had a place, each name had a mark. There was no anonymity in the system, only record. Logistics at scale, how to feed an empire. One of the greatest feats of the Achaemenid bureaucracy was its ability to feed, clothe, and move people across thousands of kilometers. Consider, a quarry worker in the Zagros Mountains needed barley from the lowlands. That barley passed through 3 points of record: collection, transport, and receipt. The transport required oxen teams, which themselves were rationed and recorded. The final delivery was verified by seal, and once approved, the ration was distributed. And this wasn't an isolated event. Tens of thousands of such entries occurred each season. One mistake could starve a workforce, delay a construction project, or weaken palace stores. The empire's military logistics were similarly managed. Campaigns were supported by supply chains, with each satrapy expected to provide men, animals, food, or arms depending on seasonal quotas. This wasn't flexible. It was pre-planned, codified, and inscribed. When the army of Xerxes crossed the Hellespont into Greece, they did so with the help of bureaucratic ledgers that ensured provisions would arrive by barge, cart, or camel. A war machine powered not by heroes but by rations, requisitions, and route approvals. Bureaucracy as cultural strategy. There's something quietly profound in how the Achaemenids used paperwork not only to govern, but to unify. Despite the empire's diversity spanning Egyptians, Babylonians, Scythians, Lydians, and more, the bureaucracy translated diversity into documentation. People paid different kinds of taxes in different regions: gold, grain, horses. But all were recorded, standardized, and submitted to central authority. This allowed local traditions to continue, while still fitting into the imperial mold. In a sense, Achaemenid control was less about military occupation and more about administrative absorption. If your district's figures lined up, the king was pleased. If they didn't, auditors came knocking. The bureaucracy didn't just mirror power. It was power. Quiet, slow, meticulous power. That's what held the empire together long after the first conquests were over. The end of the archive. So what happened to this elegant, enormous system? It didn't collapse suddenly. By the time Alexander the Great conquered Persepolis in 330 BCE, the bureaucracy still functioned. But new priorities and cultural shifts began to loosen its grip. The fire at Persepolis, whether accidental or deliberate, marked the symbolic end of that era. The archives, sealed away rather than destroyed, lay dormant until the 20th century. Today, thousands of the Persepolis tablets remain untranslated. They're held at institutions like the Oriental Institute in Chicago, where slow, careful work continues. Each tablet decoded offers another dusty piece of an enormous bureaucratic jigsaw puzzle. And they tell the same story again and again: barley, beer, taxes, travel permits. They tell us that the empire was not run by its warriors or even its kings, but by its scribes. So tonight, if you listen carefully, perhaps you'll hear them: the scratch of a stylus, the quiet sigh of a clerk, the careful stacking of another tablet into another shelf. And ask yourself, is our modern world really so different from theirs? Or do we, too, live and sleep under the quiet rule of paperwork? Story 2. Regional governors and the endless reports. In the shadow of the king's golden palace, far from the battlefields and royal ceremonies, a quieter kind of power pulsed through the veins of the Achaemenid Empire. This was not the power of conquest or charisma. It was the power of reporting, tallying, and forwarding copies. This is the story of the satraps, regional governors who ruled vast territories on behalf of the Persian king. But unlike feudal lords or vassals, the satraps did not rule independently. They governed by the book, and that book was built on ledgers, reports, and the dry but necessary routines of imperial accountability. Let us open the ledger of one such governor. We will not find glory, but we will find order, and in that order the empire endured. Who were the satraps? The word satrap comes from the Old Persian kh shathrapavan, meaning protector of the province. Though the title predates the Achaemenid Empire, it took on its full administrative shape under Darius I in the late 6th century BCE. Darius inherited a sprawling, sometimes chaotic empire. From Egypt to the Indus, the lands he claimed were culturally diverse, geographically fragmented, and prone to rebellion. He responded not with decentralization but with formal, documented structure. He reorganized the empire into satrapies, each responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining security, and overseeing infrastructure. These were not symbolic appointments. Each satrap functioned as a quasi-viceroy, representing royal authority on the ground. But here's the difference. Their power was not autonomous. Satraps were kept in check not by military oversight but by bureaucratic surveillance. They were buried in paperwork. The ledger is the law. Each satrap was required to maintain and submit detailed records to the royal treasury. These records included tax collection reports, usually in multiple commodities, personnel rosters for labor, military, and administrative staff, expense accounts for building projects, military campaigns, or regional festivals, inventory reports, grain, livestock, metals, textiles, and more, judicial summaries, decisions rendered in regional courts, especially involving fines or confiscations. And these reports weren't optional. A late or inaccurate report could invite suspicion. An unfiled report could invite dismissal or worse. The satrap's office was typically staffed with multiple scribes, counters, seal bearers, and auditors. Some scribes handled regional dialects, others managed conversions between local weights and imperial standards. One satrap in Babylon might receive wheat in maris, wine in kus, and silver in shekels. Another satrap in Egypt might deal in hecat and deben. But the records sent to the capital were standardized, often converted into karu for grain or karsha for silver. In this way, the Achaemenid bureaucracy translated diversity into unity not by suppressing difference, but by recording it. The satrap's office, a machine in motion. Let's imagine a day inside the satrapal office of Sardis, capital of the wealthy province of Lydia, circa 486 BCE. The satrap, perhaps Artaphernes, a real historical figure and cousin of Darius, begins his morning not with ceremony, but with reports. First, a clerk reads aloud the previous day's tally of tribute delivered from the Meander Valley. It includes 2,000 talents of silver, weighed and sealed, 500 textile bolts, 17 horses bred for royal stables. Each item has a paper trail, a parchment record or clay tablet, a seal, a witness. Once confirmed, the items are inventoried, and a copy of the ledger is prepared for dispatch to Susa. Next, a military administrator presents a troop readiness report. The army garrisoned in Lydia includes Ionian mercenaries, Persian cavalry, and local skirmishers. Their provisioning barley, wine, oil is logged daily, and the quantities are deducted from the local storehouse ledgers. A priest from a local temple arrives to submit a declaration. The temple has received 40 sheep as offering. It will pay tribute in wool rather than animals. This, too, is recorded. Later that day, a scribe compiles the monthly report for the central treasury. The data is checked and rechecked, stamped with the satrap's seal, and added to a dispatch bag carried by a royal courier, a professional messenger who rides across the royal road, the empire's great artery, toward Persepolis. This is how the machine moves. Checks on satrapal power. Now you might wonder what stopped the satraps from lying, underreporting taxes, or skimming off the top. The answer is layered. Royal auditors appointed by the king had authority to conduct surprise inspections. These men were feared, for they answered to no one but the crown. Separate military command. In some satrapies, the military was overseen by a general independent of the satrap. This created an internal balance of power. The king's spies, sometimes called the eyes and ears of the king, operated quietly across the empire, gathering reports from towns, markets, and temples. But perhaps the greatest check was the burden of paperwork itself. Every financial transaction, every resource movement, every judgment passed, it was all recorded. And since documents were copied, archived, and sealed at multiple stages, it was extremely difficult to falsify records without collusion. Even a dishonest satrap had to work through layers of loyal scribes and auditors. The risk of exposure was high, the consequences severe. And so many satraps didn't rebel. They managed. Some accumulated wealth, yes, and patronized their local temples or cities, but they did so within the ledger. Satrapal reports as historical gold. Today, much of what we know about the empire's internal workings comes from these satrapal records. In Babylon, a treasure trove of cuneiform tablets shows taxes paid in sheep, goats, and jars of date wine. In Egypt, Greek papyri reveal how satraps balanced local traditions with imperial demands. In Bactria, Aramaic letters document requests for extra wheat rations during a drought. One particularly boring letter from a subordinate official to his satrap reads, "To Bagavant, 47 camels were transferred from Merv to Bactra. 4 died. Grain required. Please confirm receipt." That's it, dry, dull, absolutely essential. These records are not just administrative, they are anthropological. They reveal trade routes, dietary patterns, population densities, and the silent rhythms of ancient life. The satrap's dilemma. For all their power, satraps lived precariously. Appointed at the pleasure of the king, they could be replaced, recalled, or even executed if accused of incompetence or treachery. Their survival depended on balancing local diplomacy with nobles and priests, military stability in volatile borderlands, meticulous reporting to satisfy the central bureaucracy. It was not a glamorous job, but it was one of the most important in the empire. They were the interface between ruler and ruled. They translated orders into actions, and they translated actions into numbers on a page. Tonight, you rest under the imagined stars of ancient Lydia or Elam, where dusty ledgers were written under oil lamps, and every seal bore a life's worth of accountability. And as your mind settles into stillness, ask yourself, what did the satraps fear more, invading armies, or missing a line in a ledger? In the previous section, we walked through the daily routine of a satrap's office, a world not of swords and spectacles, but of sealed tablets and stacked reports. Now, let us follow those reports upstream, tracing the invisible current of oversight that ran from every provincial ledger to the central nerve of the Achaemenid Empire. This is where the quiet machinery of surveillance, fueled by ink and clay, and powered by silence, revealed itself as the true force behind imperial unity. If the satraps managed the provinces, the royal bureaucracy managed the satraps, a system that watched itself. The Achaemenid administration did not rely on trust, it relied on redundancy. Every financial record, every supply manifest, every personnel roster issued by a satrap was duplicated, sometimes triplicated. These copies were filed locally for satrapal reference, sent to regional auditors, who cross-checked them against warehouse inventories, dispatched to the royal court, where senior officials compiled empire-wide summaries. This created a triple-entry system, centuries before such ideas appeared in commercial accounting. If a report from Egypt didn't match grain records from Phoenician trade logs, or if Bactria's tribute fell short of expectations, the discrepancy triggered investigation. The beauty of the system wasn't in its brilliance but in its tedium. Predictable, slow-moving, repetitive, but effective. And at the center of this web of watchfulness was a cadre of officials who never ruled, never fought, and yet held immense power. The royal auditors, eyes without glory. The royal auditors, sometimes known by their Greek nickname, the king's eyes, were appointed directly by the monarch. They reported to no satrap. They carried sealed writs of authority and moved independently between provinces. Their role was to conduct surprise inspections of satrapal accounts, interview lower officials, scribes, or even townspeople, ensure standardized weights and measures were upheld, investigate corruption, fraud, or unreported income. Importantly, they did not simply read documents. They verified them against physical reality. If a satrap reported 50,000 sheep in a provincial tax report, auditors could demand visual confirmation, sometimes even ordering on-site animal counts. If coinage tributes were received, they would weigh the silver to ensure standardization. We know from fragments of Herodotus and Babylonian texts that these audits were not rare, and that satraps feared them more than royal decrees. Why? Because a satrap could appeal a decree, he could petition the king. But if an audit found him falsifying records, there was no appeal. The penalties of paperwork, punishment for bureaucratic failure varied. Some examples drawn from later sources, like Seleucid adaptations and Babylonian parallels, include public fines paid in silver or livestock, removal from office, confiscation of property. In rare but notable cases, execution, especially if military supplies were falsified. It was not the act that mattered most, it was the paper trail. A satrap might overcollect taxes and spend them on local temple construction. That might be forgiven if reported properly, but failing to record the funds or misrepresenting allocations, that was treason against the empire's paperwork. And it's here that we encounter something truly unique about the Achaemenid state, a king who ruled through documents, not above them. The king's role, final reader, silent judge. The Persian king did not micromanage. He did not sit reading every grain ledger from Sogdiana, but his court, the imperial bureaucracy, did. Senior officials reviewed monthly summaries and annual tribute reports. They charted increases or decreases in provincial revenue, population changes based on census data, military resource flow, especially during campaign seasons. Based on this data, the king made appointments, granted tax remissions, or launched investigations. The system allowed for something incredibly modern, data-driven governance. If 3 years of reports showed a province declining in yield, the king might adjust tribute demands or dispatch agricultural specialists. If troop supply records showed late deliveries, the satrap responsible might be summoned to court. This didn't make the empire democratic, but it made it responsive, at least in its functioning. Satraps under pressure, a case study in bureaucratic fragility. One of the most well-known satrapal scandals occurred in Egypt, under the satrap Arians, c. 525–496 BCE. Arians minted his own silver coinage, the Ariandic, without royal permission. More than a political offense, this was a bureaucratic violation because minting currency required strict accounting oversight. By sidestepping that process, Arians both broke monetary policy and erased a paper trail. Darius I, upon discovering this act, likely through royal auditors, removed Arians from office. Some sources suggest execution, though this is debated. It's worth noting, the offense wasn't treason in a military sense. It was administrative disobedience, a break in standardized reporting. The empire could forgive rebellions more easily than it could forgive missing numbers. Scribes as informants. Another clever feature of the Achaemenid bureaucracy was the distribution of loyalty. A satrap might command soldiers, but he did not own his scribes. These men were trained in imperial centers, paid by the crown, and bound by law to report irregularities. In fact, it's believed that scribes were encouraged to report discrepancies to royal auditors. Some scribes even kept shadow copies of documents' secret versions that might be used if their primary record was accidentally changed or destroyed under satrapal pressure. This means the bureaucracy did not merely record reality, it protected it from manipulation. In this way, a network of quiet, literate men ensured the empire's internal honesty. They were the immune system of the Achaemenid state. When reports became reputation, despite the risk, some satraps flourished. Those who submitted accurate, detailed, and timely reports were often rewarded with expanded responsibilities. A well-managed satrapy might receive imperial investment, new infrastructure, artisans, or military protection. Thus, a satrap's reputation at court depended as much on his paperwork as on his politics. Some even cultivated scribal excellence as a form of prestige. In Susa, for example, a satrap's court became known for training exceptional Aramaic scribes, men who went on to serve in Bactria, Armenia, and the Indus Valley. In this world, accuracy was power, punctuality was loyalty, and silence on the page, that was the greatest danger of all. So as the ink dries in the margins of an ancient scroll, and the fire in the satrap's record room fades to embers, consider the strange fate of these forgotten officials. They did not conquer. They did not inspire. They reported. And in doing so, they held together the greatest empire the world had yet known. Now, as you fall into a softer silence, ask yourself, if a satrap's power was measured in pages, how many ledgers would it take to be remembered? As we come to the end of the satrap's story, we move beyond the parchment and clay. In this closing section, we ask, what did all this record-keeping really achieve? What happens when a civilization places its trust not in charisma, but in columns and tallies? This is where the machinery of the Achaemenid state reveals its final shape, not as a map of lands and cities, but as a chart of duties and forms, moving through the veins of an empire where paperwork was the price of peace. The final chain of command. By now, we know that a satrap was more than a provincial lord. He was part of a deeply layered administrative ecosystem, one in which no single piece of information could exist in isolation. From village tax collectors to district scribes, from warehouse overseers to road administrators, the satrap coordinated hundreds, sometimes thousands of individuals. But they all answered to the chain of record, not to personality or family ties. Every official reported to someone else. The village recorder submitted population counts to the district clerk. The district clerk forwarded grain tallies to the provincial treasurer. The treasurer, with the satrap seal, sent full ledgers to Persepolis or Susa. At each stage, verifications, seals, countersigns, and copying were required. Nothing moved without a trail. In an age before telegraphs or emails, this was the only way to ensure that the satrap in Egypt and the one in Bactria were working from the same reality. It was time-consuming. It was repetitive. It was brilliant. Bureaucracy as a tool of equality. Though the Achaemenid Empire was built on hierarchy, its bureaucratic framework brought something rare to antiquity: procedural fairness. Tribute quotas were standardized by province, not by individual whim. Laborer rations were recorded consistently. Even elite satraps had to submit to audits and reviews. Everyone's authority could be checked. In many ways, the bureaucracy served as the great equalizer in an unequal world. It offered predictability, a known process for grievances, a rhythm to the chaos of daily life. Even local communities, such as temple districts or farming cooperatives, engaged with this system. They submitted petitions, registered livestock, or requested drought relief through forms. These forms passed up the chain, eventually landing on a desk in the satrap's office, surrounded by ink pots and weary scribes. Sometimes they were granted, sometimes not. But the fact that they were recorded at all, that was revolutionary. Cracks in the clay, and yet no system lasts forever. By the time of Darius III, late 4th century BCE, the empire's bureaucratic structure showed signs of strain. Delayed communications meant slow responses to regional crises. Tribute overburdens caused unrest in border provinces. Localized corruption, while still rare in records, became more common in Greek and Babylonian complaints. Most devastating of all was the sclerosis of scale. The very complexity that had sustained the empire began to choke it. Reforms became difficult. Innovations were resisted not from rebellion, but from inertia. By the time Alexander the Great arrived, the system was still functional but brittle. His conquest didn't destroy the bureaucracy. In many places, he adopted it. The satrap system was retained under Seleucid and later Parthian rule. Forms were updated. Languages changed. But the logic, the enduring belief that a well-kept ledger was stronger than a sword survived. What remained? What do we remember of these satraps? Not their faces, not their voices. We remember their accounts. Clay tablets, Aramaic scrolls, stone inscriptions. A satrap in Egypt reported 1,000 talents of silver. Another in Babylon filed records of grain shortfalls during a flood year. A third in Lydia stamped his seal on the delivery of 120 sheep to the royal palace. These are not tales of glory. They are entries, methodical and mundane. But they outlasted palaces, they outlasted kings, they outlasted time. Even now, archaeologists and historians continue to piece together these records, reconstructing the daily reality of an empire not through poetry or monuments, but through the weight of paperwork. Bureaucracy as empire's soul. And so, the satrap's legacy is not one of conquest. It is continuity. Through them, the Achaemenid Empire developed the first known model of federal administration, a tiered, supervised, interconnected system of governance that could manage cultural diversity and geographic spread. It allowed the empire to function without needing constant royal presence. It delegated trust, but documented it thoroughly. It treated data as sacred. In doing so, it created a model so efficient, so quietly effective, that echoes of it can still be seen in modern administrative states. When we file taxes, register land, log inventory, or submit a permit, we walk in the satrap's footsteps. So tonight, as the stars pass over what was once a provincial governor's record room, and the wind slips between the crumbling walls of forgotten offices, remember this. Great empires do not collapse from battle alone. They collapse when their files are no longer opened. And ask yourself, if history remembers kings in stone, but satraps in scribbles who really kept the world turning. Story 3. The world's most organized snail mail. Before roads were measured in miles or meters, before there were traffic signs or border crossings, there was the royal road of the Achaemenid Empire, a ribbon of hardened earth, stretching over 2,500 kilometers from Sardis in Anatolia to Susa in Elam. And on this road moved not armies, not merchants, but messages. This is the story of the world's first reliable postal system, a masterpiece not of engineering alone, but of logistical administration, bureaucratic forethought, and an almost sacred commitment to speed, consistency, and order. Tonight we trace the path of a single message, one letter, one clay tablet carried across the backbone of an empire, so that the king in Persepolis could know what had happened, a world away, just days before. Let's begin where all Achaemenid messages begin, with trust in a courier. The road itself, where empire was etched into earth. The royal road wasn't just a single road, it was a system, an arterial network of major and minor routes carefully maintained by the imperial government. But the most famous segment, described by Herodotus, ran from Sardis in modern-day Turkey to Susa in southwestern Iran. This route covered approximately 2,699 kilometers, and it was maintained by royal decree. According to Herodotus, there is nothing mortal faster than these couriers. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents them from completing their appointed course with all speed. Sound familiar? It should. These words were later borrowed by the United States Postal Service, but their origin lies here in the dusty legs of men and horses crossing ancient Anatolia. The road itself was guarded, measured, and divided into stages. It wasn't just a pathway, it was an administrative achievement. The relay stations, where bureaucracy meets the saddle. Every 25-30 kilometers, a relay station called a paradazes in Old Persian waited to receive messengers. Each station included a postmaster, responsible for recording incoming and outgoing traffic, fresh horses kept fed and trained, simple lodging and provisions, a recording scribe who logged the messenger, time of arrival and destination. The system worked like this. A royal courier carrying a message from the satrap of Lydia would arrive at a station near Sardis. The postmaster would log the delivery and provide a fresh horse. The message would pass into the hands of the next courier, who would gallop toward the next station. At each stop, the process repeated clockwork in motion, mile after mile. In optimal conditions, a message could travel the full 2,700 kilometers from Sardis to Susa in 7-9 days. Compare that to the travel time for a merchant caravan, 3 months. Speed wasn't just a luxury, it was a strategic asset. The messenger's burden. Now imagine you are the courier. Your name is Barsine, and you've been running the same central segment from Arbela to Ecbatana for 6 years. You carry a small clay tablet wrapped in waxed linen. It bears a seal of the satrap, and on it is an update about a locust outbreak near the Tigris. The king must know because locusts mean grain loss, and grain loss means ration disruption. You receive the tablet, gallop your leg of the journey, and pass the message off. No delays, no excuses. But the job is not glamorous. You sleep little, eat quickly, and if you lose a message, drop it in a river, or arrive late, you answer to royal auditors. Couriers like Barsine were trained, tracked, and graded. Their performance was recorded at each station, and their assignments depended on speed and reliability. Some were demoted for poor delivery times. Others were honored given better routes, newer horses, or even gifts from the king. And though they were rarely seen in court, their names lived in the margins of postmaster logs, where time and message met in clay. What was sent? The Achaemenid postal system did not serve the public. It was state-run, and its traffic was state content. Tax reports, military updates, supply requests, royal decrees, audits, and administrative communications. Most messages were short, concise, and coded in known bureaucratic forms. Some were written in Aramaic, the lingua franca, others in Old Persian or Elamite, depending on origin. For sensitive information, clay tablets were often double encased. The inner tablet bore the message. The outer clay shell bore the seal, a tamper-evident surface. If the seal was broken upon arrival, someone had opened it. This security mechanism, 2-layered tablets, offered early protection against both theft and forgery. In this way, the bureaucracy didn't just move messages, it ensured their integrity. The role of the satraps in the court. Satraps relied heavily on this system. A satrap in Bactria could alert the king to crop shortages or rebellion in a week. In turn, he might receive royal instructions, written months earlier, that shaped his upcoming policy. The king's court at Persepolis, Susa, or Ecbatana received hundreds of such messages, daily or weekly. They were sorted by scribes, prioritized by topic, and sent to the appropriate office: military, treasury, religious, or judicial. Messages that required royal attention were read to the king during audience sessions. He might reply by dictating a short order, which was then recorded and sent back via the same postal chain. The king did not need to tour his empire. The empire reported to him on clay legs. Bureaucracy on horseback. It is tempting to think of the royal road as a marvel of engineering, and it was. But its greater achievement was bureaucratic. Organizing resources across distances, staffing and supervising posts, standardizing message formats, logging movements in ledgers, maintaining expected delivery times. Every relay station had its own logs. These logs were reviewed. Postmasters submitted monthly reports detailing how many messages passed through, any delays or damages, horse usage and replacements. This ensured the system remained predictable. If Sardis sent a letter at noon on the 1st, Susa could expect it by the 9th. If it did arrive, a courier was missing or worse. The system demanded consistency. It rewarded clerical excellence. So as your thoughts begin to slow and your breath finds its rhythm, picture the royal road at dusk. A thin line across the horizon, a quiet hoofbeat in the distance, and a wax tablet wrapped in linen, pressed with the seal of a world you'll never know. And ask yourself, was this truly the first postal service, or was it the first nervous system of empire? In the quiet world of ancient Persia, beneath the grandeur of palaces and the echo of armies, a hum of activity followed the path of the royal road. It was not the noise of celebration, nor of conquest, but of ledgers opened, horses groomed, tablets pressed, and seals warmed over flame. This section peels back the curtain on the administrative life of the Achaemenid postal system, not the road itself, but the system of control that allowed information to travel through 2,700 kilometers of territory with remarkable speed and consistency. Here we explore how an empire, long before email or railways, managed to tie its cities together using only horses, clay, and bureaucracy. Maintaining the system, who kept the road alive. The royal road was not a military highway, nor was it intended for public use. It was a government asset, one maintained, audited, and serviced by a network of administrative offices that functioned across the satrapies. Responsibility for upkeep fell to several key actors. Satrapal offices oversaw local portions of the road network within their province and reported on road conditions and station operations to the central government. Royal inspectors traveled periodically to assess the functionality of the system and report directly to the king's administration. Station keepers, postmasters, managed individual relay points. These were often hereditary positions, with families entrusted to maintain reliability over generations. Each station had to meet a set of bureaucratic expectations. Maintain ready horses well fed and fit for travel. Keep records of messages sent and received. Record the exact time each courier arrived and departed. Track horse usage to ensure rotational fairness and health. These expectations were not theoretical. They were inspected. Failure to maintain standards could lead to demotion, fines, or in rare cases, confiscation of the post itself. The empire's road was a road of accountability. Horses, supplies, and budgets. The empire didn't just assign couriers and hope for the best. It created a centralized support structure for every leg of the journey. Each station's operating budget was tied to number of horses maintained, number of couriers assigned, amount of grain, barley, or fodder consumed monthly, wear and tear on riding gear, saddles, bridles. All of this was recorded. Consider a sample administrative entry that might have appeared in the satrapal records from the district of Ecbatana. Month 6, Year 12 of Darius. Station 14 reports 16 horses maintained, 4 needing replacement, lameness noted. 128 karu of barley consumed. 32 messages relayed, 2 courier delays due to storm. Signed Harbashu, keeper of Station 14. Simple, precise, entirely boring. And yet, without entries like these, the royal road would have collapsed into disuse. The role of standardization. A key feature of the Achaemenid administrative system, especially visible in the postal service, was its obsession with standardization. From Sardis to Susa, from the Black Sea to the Indus, measurements and expectations were consistent. Distance, relay stations were spaced based on horse endurance, typically 25-30 kilometers. Time, couriers were expected to cover their segments within a fixed window. Failure to do so triggered a review. Message formats. Most communications followed strict bureaucratic templates, with headers denoting origin, destination, date, sender seal and message category, military, taxation, ceremonial, etc. Seals. Each station bore a unique official seal, which was logged at the Central Record Office. This meant that an official in Babylon could decode, file, and reply to a message from Ecbatana, using the exact same procedures he would use for Susa or Sardis. It made messages not only faster but interchangeable, no matter the origin. And that made an empire out of provinces. The quiet dangers of delay. The speed of the royal road wasn't for prestige, it was for control. Delays in messaging could mean a rebellion in Bactria going unnoticed for too long, a grain shortage in Media turning into famine, a military recall reaching its recipient after an enemy had invaded. Thus, postmasters and scribes treated delays as failures of duty. They investigated lost messages. They demanded logs. They cross-checked delivery times and compared courier statements. It was common for duplicate messages to be sent through alternate routes or with staggered timing to prevent total information loss. Some messages were even sent in pairs, with one ahead of the other, just in case. And in all of this, the role of the scribe was central. He didn't ride, he didn't rule. But he wrote it all down. When messages were just messages. Some letters changed lives. Consider this hypothetical but plausible message. To the satrap of Egypt. Royal decree. Beginning in month 3, tribute will shift from 450 talents of silver to 380 talents, in accordance with current yield reports. Additionally, permission is granted to rebuild temple storehouses lost in flood. From the hand of the king. Sealed by Artaxerxes, chief scribe. Dispatched from Susa on the 9th day of month 2. This small message would trigger a tax change affecting thousands of households, a construction project engaging dozens of scribes, builders, and warehouse managers, temple coordination with local priests and labor forces, one courier, one road, one piece of clay, tens of thousands of people affected. This was the weight of the royal road, not its gravel, but its impact. The human element. For all its structure, the postal system was only as good as the people within it. Messengers were not machines. They grew tired. They fell ill. Some died en route, victims of heat, snow, robbery, or animal attack. The system accounted for this. It kept spare horses, backup messengers, and reserve tablets. It assumed failure and then planned around it. Still, behind every message was a human hand. Each stamp of the seal, each tied string, each scrawled header made by someone whose name might never be recorded. And yet, their diligence kept an empire together. Their tools were not swords but saddlebags, wax, and ink. Now, as the imagined hooves grow fainter in your ears and the lamp in the station house flickers low, think on this: that long before us, an empire lived by messages and died by delay. And ask yourself, when you send a message, do you imagine the road it takes or the quiet hands that carry it? We have followed the royal road from one end of the empire to the other. We've met the couriers, reviewed the ledgers, and admired the eerie perfection of a postal system older than empires that would one day imitate it. Now, in this final section, we witness what happens when that system so careful, so coordinated, so calm begins to falter. This is the slow unraveling, not with a bang, but with missing seals, delayed horses, and stations left abandoned. It is a lesson in how great powers fall not through sudden war alone, but when their most boring systems no longer work. The warning signs. The royal road began to suffer long before Alexander of Macedon crossed into Persian lands. Even in the reigns of the later Achaemenid kings, cracks had begun to form. Several signs foreshadowed the breakdown. Underfunded relay stations, satraps, struggling with local rebellions or declining revenues, began redirecting funds away from postal maintenance. Reduced audits. As court politics grew more complex and regional rivalries intensified, royal inspectors became less frequent and less feared. Horse shortages, plague, and warfare affected the state's breeding programs. Some stations reused horses too often, causing delays and breakdowns. Courier attrition. Recruitment into the courier system declined, especially in remote provinces. Some messengers were pressed into military service instead. And perhaps most telling, messages began to arrive late, not weeks late, days. But in a system where hours once mattered, even a day's delay had strategic consequences. A message that didn't arrive. There is no single record of the royal road's failure, but imagine this. A military officer in the eastern satrapy of Drangiana, modern-day southeastern Iran, notices unusual movement along the border. Tribes are gathering. Raiders, perhaps, or worse, an early push from Alexander's scouts. He sends a courier with a report to the satrap in a Rakosia. The message is clear: mobilize reserves, fortify supply lines, request permission to relocate granaries inland. But the courier's path crosses a damaged stretch of road. A storm has flooded the river. The ferry has broken. He waits, then detours. The next relay station is short-staffed. No fresh horses. He rides his own. By the time the message reaches the satrap's office, 5 days have passed. And by then, the movement has become an incursion. It's only one message, one missed opportunity, but now imagine 10, then 100, then 1,000. The fragility of a silent system. Because the royal road was silent, no smoke signals, no shouting, no war drums, it was easy to forget that it even existed. But it was the empire's central nervous system. Without it, the court was blind to unrest. Satraps were isolated. Military units lacked coordination. Trade movements became uncertain. And yet, it did not collapse all at once. Even during Alexander's invasion, portions of the system remained functioning. In fact, one of Alexander's first objectives was to secure the road system, so he could redirect it for his own communications. He recognized the truth: the road didn't belong to Persia, it belonged to power. The bureaucracy outlives the empire. What's extraordinary is how long the Achaemenid communication model endured. The Seleucid Empire, successors to Alexander in the east, retained much of the relay infrastructure. The Parthians maintained sections of the old roads, though their postal system became slower. Even the Romans, in time, adopted courier models that echoed the Achaemenid system down to the spacing of stations and the use of official travel permits, diploma. Some historians argue that the royal road, or at least its conceptual framework, survived in some form for 800 years. Its endurance wasn't because of roads or horses, it was because of record keeping. Messages required a standard format, a seal of authority, a relay protocol, a chain of responsibility. These ideas didn't vanish, they spread. The human cost of lost messages. We must remember that the royal road wasn't just about kings and governors. It was also about families, farmers, and functionaries whose daily lives depended on the empire's unseen pulse. When the messages stopped arriving, tax exemptions weren't processed, food shipments weren't rerouted during droughts, military orders lagged behind enemy advances, court decisions never reached the petitioners. In some places this meant starvation, in others rebellion. But in most cases, it simply meant uncertainty. And for an empire that prided itself on predictable administration, uncertainty was the first step toward unraveling. The quiet echo. No monument was ever built to the royal road. No tablet was carved with the names of postmasters or scribes who kept it alive. And yet, without them, Darius would have been blind. Xerxes would have commanded chaos. The empire itself would have been a loosely tethered dream. The road may have carried news of war, but it was built for peace, for barley tallies, for appointment confirmations, for flood reports, for travel approvals. It was built so the king could know what happened in the farthest village without ever leaving his court. It was boring, and it was beautiful. So as the final messenger of this story fades into a sleeplit horizon, saddle empty, message delivered, road behind him disappearing into sand and stars, reflect on this. Is a civilization great because of the battles it wins or the messages it manages to deliver, day after day, without applause? Story 4. How ancient Iran counted its people. It is easy to imagine ancient Persia in grand terms: golden palaces, mighty kings, armies sweeping across deserts. But beneath the crowns and conquests, the empire's real strength rested on something far more ordinary: knowing how many people lived within it. This story is not about a heroic battle or royal decree. It is about counting, not counting riches or victories, but people, their families, their work, their animals, their tax obligations, their births and deaths. Welcome to the census, a quiet, methodical, and often invisible process that allowed the Achaemenid state to keep its vast territories functional. A practice so mundane it rarely appears in historical chronicles, yet so essential that without it, no bureaucracy, no tax system, and no empire could function. Let us now begin, as every census did, with the sound of a scribe knocking on a door. Why count? The logic behind ancient data. The Achaemenid Empire spanned over 5 million square kilometers, from Egypt and Thrace in the west to the Indus Valley in the east. To manage this sprawl, the central government needed data, not abstract philosophical ideas, but cold, exacting numbers. How many laborers were available in a province? How many goats were being herded in a village? How much grain could be expected in a season? How many taxable households existed in a region? And perhaps most importantly, was this number higher or lower than last year? The answers to these questions didn't just float to the capital on rumor. They had to be collected, verified, and recorded. That is what the census did. And yet it wasn't a single event. It was a continuous process. Each satrapy, through its local bureaucratic offices, conducted periodic counts, often every few years, sometimes annually. These efforts weren't celebratory, they were routine, dull, predictable. But behind their predictability was imperial power. The mechanics of a count. So how was a census conducted in ancient Iran? The exact mechanisms varied from province to province, but scholars believe that under Darius I, A system of standardized enumeration was developed borrowed in part from Babylonian, Elamite, and Assyrian traditions. The process generally involved local scribes, trained officials traveled from village to village, equipped with clay tablets, ink, or parchment scrolls. They were accompanied by assistants and occasionally guards. Family interviews. Heads of households were asked to report the number of family members, livestock owned, and types of labor performed. Property assessment. Land and goods were evaluated not just for ownership, but for productive value. A plot of farmland was judged not by size alone, but by what it produced. Verification. Other villagers were sometimes interviewed to cross-verify information, especially in areas where tax evasion was suspected. Seal authentication. Once compiled, the census record was sealed with the official stamp of the scribe or local governor and sent up the bureaucratic chain. The whole process was tedious. It might take weeks to cover a district. The results tables of names, ages, animals, crop yields were filed away in regional archives and used to calculate taxes, labor drafts, and food allocations. And then it was repeated again. A census in action, a hypothetical case. Imagine a village near the Zagros Mountains, call it Anzartash. It is late spring. The barley harvest is done. A census team arrives from the local administration office in Susa. They begin with the village headman. How many reside in your household? 8, myself, my wife, 2 sons, 3 daughters, and my father. Animals: 12 sheep, 4 goats, 1 ox. Land: 2 plots, 1 fallow, 1 barley yielding. The scribe writes this all down, cross-checks the figures with past records, moves on to the next house. By nightfall, he's logged 20 families, dozens of livestock, grain projections for next year. He stamps the tablet and stores it with the others. By month's end, the district office compiles the village data. The results are sent to the satrapal office in Susa. There, a tax plan is drawn, how much each household will owe in silver, labor, or barley. No one celebrates. But the empire turns one more notch on its slow, well-oiled axis. Who was counted and who was not? The Achaemenid census was not egalitarian. While most adult males were counted as labor or tax contributors, women, children, and the elderly were often recorded as dependents important for food allocation, but not directly taxed. Exceptions existed. Widows who owned property could appear as independent taxpayers. Temple personnel, including some female workers, were often exempt or separately categorized. Nomadic tribes were notoriously difficult to count. The empire often used proxy estimates based on known migration patterns or trade tallies. Interestingly, slaves and indentured laborers were also counted often under their master's name. Their numbers were vital for labor distribution and food rations. The census, in this way, was not just a tool of taxation. It was a map of social structure. It told the government who worked, who served, who needed grain, and who was invisible. Problems and punishments. Like all bureaucracies, the Persian census wasn't perfect. Overcounting could inflate a region's value, leading to higher tribute demands. Undercounting could shortchange the central treasury or hide draftable workers. False reporting was a serious offense. Auditors were periodically sent to investigate census records, especially if the region had a history of inconsistency. If discrepancies were found, scribes could be fined or reassigned. Village heads could be punished, especially if suspected of conspiracy. Entire districts might face labor levies to make up for falsified numbers. Still, these were rare. Most census operations were performed quietly, under the watchful but impersonal eye of the empire. The goal was never drama, it was always stability. Tonight, as the hum of distant numbers fades behind your mind's quiet door, consider this. In a world without computers, satellites, or census bureaus, thousands of people counted others by hand, one home at a time, year after year. And ask yourself, what does it mean to be known, not by name but by number? Now, we move away from the counting itself and into what happened after the counting was done. Because the real power of the census in the Achaemenid Empire wasn't the act of enumeration, it was what the numbers were used for. This is a story not of rulers or rebellions, but of data, collected, compiled, analyzed, and used to govern millions. Tonight, we explore how a faceless bureaucracy turned individual lives into rows and columns, and how that system shaped who paid, who served, and who was fed. Let us now follow the path of a number. From village to court, the flow of data. When a scribe completed a local census, be it of households, livestock, land, or laborers, the data didn't stay in the village. Hear what happened next. Initial compilation. The local administrative office, usually a district or temple complex, received the records. There, junior clerks aggregated totals, population counts, grain output, draftable labor, taxable wealth. Translation and formatting. Because the empire used multiple languages, Elamite, Aramaic, Babylonian, and Old Persian, the data was often transcribed or translated to match imperial formats. This ensured consistency across regions. Submission to the satrapal office. Each satrapy had a central office that reviewed the district-level reports. Errors were corrected. Anomalies were flagged. Satrapal scribes created summaries with standardized headings, seals, and annotations. Dispatched to the central archive. Copies of these summaries were sent to the capital cities Persepolis, Susa, or Ecbatana via courier. These tablets and scrolls joined thousands of others in archive rooms. At each stage, information was compressed. What began as a name and family story became a set of figures. By the time it reached the king's court, no faces remained, only numbers. And from those numbers, policy was made. How the data was used. Census data wasn't collected for curiosity. It was used to run the empire's core systems. 1. Taxation. The most obvious use of census data was for setting tribute quotas. Each satrapy had an annual obligation measured in silver, gold, livestock, textiles, or agricultural produce. These quotas were adjusted based on census numbers, how many taxable households. Output reports, what was the harvest like. Historical compliance, has this district paid on time before? If a region's population had decreased due to famine or disease, its tribute might be reduced. If it grew or produced a surplus, its quota might increase. The goal was to maintain equity and obligation, not fairness, necessarily, but predictable supply. 2. Labor drafts in public works. When the king ordered a construction project, say, a palace addition in Susa or a road expansion in Media, he needed workers. The census told officials which districts had surplus laborers, how many could be spared, what skills were available, stonemasons, carpenters, basket weavers, etc. Local officials received labor levies, directing a specified number of workers to report for imperial service, often on a seasonal basis. These men were provided rations and housing during their work, but their presence was tracked. Each name became an entry in another ledger. Without the census, these projects would be impossible to plan. With it, labor could be mobilized without chaos. 3. Military conscription. While the Achaemenid Empire relied heavily on professional troops and foreign levies, it also drafted local militias for certain conflicts or garrison duties. Census records were used to estimate available fighting-age men, weapons and horses owned by households, tribal affiliations, which could affect loyalty and deployment. A stable province might send troops for border defense. A less trustworthy one might be asked only for food or draft animals. These decisions weren't made by whim. They were based on census returns. Hidden insights in the data. We might think of ancient data as primitive, but the Achaemenid record-keeping reveals something startlingly modern, a desire not just to count, but to analyze. Scribes created comparative tables. They recorded year-on-year trends. Were births rising? Were households splitting or consolidating? Was livestock increasing in one village and declining in another? Even things like climate effects, floods, droughts, poor harvests were annotated alongside census data to explain anomalies. In other words, they weren't just collecting data, they were contextualizing it. This allowed the empire to act strategically. A tax remission wasn't a gift, it was a decision backed by numbers. A labor draft wasn't random, it was calibrated to avoid collapsing a local economy. This data was the empire, the scribes who made it possible. And yet, none of this worked without the tireless work of scribes. These men and occasionally women weren't exalted. Most were middle-class professionals trained in regional capitals. Their tools were basic: styluses, clay tablets, simple inks, and wax. But their discipline was unmatched. They memorized categories of land, labor, and livestock. They copied and recopied data by hand. They knew how to cross-reference figures and flag inconsistencies. They understood imperial units, weights, and exchange rates. For them, the census was not just paperwork. It was precision survival. A miscount could mean misallocated rations. A typo could send too many men to work camps or too few to build a dam. Their job was not dramatic, but it was essential. And like so many before and after them, they were only remembered in the margins, in small signatures at the bottom of tablets, or in seals left behind on forgotten reports. When numbers lied. Of course, data was not always pure. There were incentives to cheat. Villages might underreport to lower their taxes. Officials might overreport labor to impress their superiors. In rare cases, entire districts falsified records under pressure from local elites. The empire responded by sending auditors to cross-check reports, implementing randomized surveys, issuing collective punishments if fraud was discovered. Still, not all lies were caught. Some census records were trusted more than they deserved, and over time, as bureaucracy expanded and oversight waned, the accuracy of the census may have declined. Yet for 2 centuries it held. So now, as the columns of figures fade from your imagination and the dull scrape of styluses recedes into sleep, consider this: that long before spreadsheets, long before databases, human beings stared into clay and ink and tried to understand the shape of their world through numbers. And ask yourself, when no one remembers your name, will the data you leave behind tell your story? In our journey through the quiet mechanics of the ancient Persian census, we've walked through village lanes, peered into the ledgers of satraps, and glimpsed how numbers, not myths, held the empire together. But now, in this final section, we ask a question that is never posed in royal inscriptions or surviving clay tablets. What happens when the numbers stop coming? Because they did. The counting stopped, the scribes fell silent, the reports never arrived. Not all at once, not in every place, but enough to matter. This is the slow unraveling of an empire, not through invasion alone, but through administrative silence, a world that ceased to be counted, and so ceased to be. The first missing numbers. Before a collapse, there are discrepancies. At first, they were small. A village failed to send its updated population roll. A shipment of tax silver was sent with no names attached. A labor list was submitted with blank rows. These early anomalies were usually blamed on local mismanagement or environmental disruptions, plagues, famines, floods. They were temporary, the scribes assumed. The next census would correct them. But over time, the gaps grew wider. Entire districts returned partial counts. Names were missing. Animals were estimated instead of verified. Scribes started copying from old records to fill in the blanks. A village that hadn't been visited in 2 years. Just repeat last year's numbers. Accuracy gave way to convenience. And convenience, in time, became the death of knowledge. The collapse of local control. The Achaemenid state depended on tiered oversight. If local administrators failed to report, satraps could step in. If satraps became ineffective, the central government intervened. But during the later reigns, especially under Darius III, the last Achaemenid king, the system began to unravel from the edges. In provinces like Egypt, Bactria, and Lydia, regional unrest interfered with the counting process. Villages resisted visits from scribes. Roads became unsafe for travel. Food shortages turned census officials into targets, seen as symbols of taxation rather than servants of stability. Meanwhile, wars on the empire's western frontier, against the growing threat of Macedon, pulled resources away from administration and into defense. The scribes were left unsupported. Census efforts became sporadic. In some provinces, they ceased altogether. The state could no longer say how many people lived under its banner, or what they owned, or what they owed. It ruled in name alone. The ghost empire, data without people. Even as real counts failed, paper counts continued. Tablets were still filled, reports still sent, but much of it was fabricated, a bureaucratic performance, numbers copied from years past, no longer anchored to reality. A village abandoned due to drought, still listed. Livestock stolen by raiders, still counted. Families migrated to neighboring provinces, still taxed. The empire began managing phantoms, taxing the invisible, ordering the non-existent, and punishing the absent. One can almost imagine a scribe in Persepolis staring at a ledger, nodding that 14,000 bushels of barley should have arrived from a district in Elam. They didn't, but the record says they did. So it is written, so it must be. This is how a system detaches from the world it was meant to measure. Alexander and the shattered registry. By the time Alexander the Great entered Persian lands in the 330s BCE, the imperial census system was still formally in place, but badly damaged. One of Alexander's first objectives, after defeating Darius III, was to seize administrative centers not just for their gold, but for their records. He knew that to rule an empire, you needed more than soldiers, you needed names, counts, assets, routes. What he found varied by region. In Susa and Persepolis, many central records remained intact though already outdated. In peripheral satrapies, especially those recently rebellious, records were fragmented, missing, or falsified. Some scribes had fled, some archives had burned, some systems had simply ceased to function. The empire Alexander conquered was already slipping away, not by fire, but by forgetting. After the fall, counting in new hands. The Achaemenid methods didn't vanish overnight. Alexander's administration adopted and adapted Persian record-keeping. His successors, the Seleucids, retained the use of local census teams and continued temple registrations and satrapal reports. But the imperial unity of the data was gone. The Seleucid Empire was more fragmented. Records became more localized. Standardization broke down. The Achaemenid vision of a world counted under a single system had passed. What remained were records in ruins, half-translated tablets, abandoned storehouses filled with dust-covered scrolls, and the fading memory of scribes who once knew how many sheep grazed in every valley, how many mouths kneaded barley in every village, how many children were born beneath the imperial sun. What is lost when we stop counting? You might ask, why does this matter? After all, people lived, worked, and died before and after the Achaemenid census. Empires rose and fell. Why does the absence of a few thousand clay tablets matter? Because when we stop counting, we lose more than data. We lose accountability, who gets what, who pays what. Continuity, what has changed, what has remained. Memory, what existed at all. A village not counted becomes a village forgotten. A life not entered into the record becomes a life untraceable. And an empire that no longer knows what it governs is no longer truly governing. So tonight, as your thoughts drift from census scrolls to silent streets, from scribes' lamps to empty columns on forgotten forms, consider this. An empire can fall not when its walls are breached, but when its numbers lie. And ask yourself, in the end, are we remembered by what we did or by what someone else bothered to record? Story 5. Food Distribution in Achaemenid Bureaucracy. You've heard of kings and their conquests, of armies on the march and cities built in stone. But behind it all, hidden beneath the polished records of glory, lies the most essential machinery of empire: feeding people. Before laws could be enforced, before temples could be built, before a soldier could lift a spear, someone had to deliver the barley. This is the story of food in the Achaemenid Empire. Not feasts or famine, but the planned, calculated, endlessly repetitive act of distribution. It is a story of scribes weighing rations, warehouses stocked with oil and wine, and receipts scrawled in Elamite about a day's worth of onions. It is a quiet story, but a heavy one, because it carried an empire. Tonight, let us walk into the grain storeroom of Persepolis. Breathe the dust. Watch the clerk press a stylus into a soft clay tablet, and let us begin, one ration at a time. Why rationing mattered. The Achaemenid Empire stretched from Libya to India, encompassing deserts, highlands, river valleys, and coastlines. Its population included palace workers and artisans, state laborers on royal projects, military garrisons, temple staff and dependents, farmers in semi-independent communities. Each of these groups required regular, measured sustenance, often provided by the state as a form of payment. In a society where money was limited or unused in many regions, the state often compensated labor with barley, the staple grain, beer made from barley, wine, dates, meat, or oil depending on rank. These rations weren't generous, but they were calculated for survival, to keep a worker alive and productive. It wasn't generosity, it was planning. The fortification tablets, a menu of empire. Our main source for this system is the Persepolis Fortification Archive, a collection of over 30,000 clay tablets uncovered in the 1930s, dating mostly to the reign of Darius I.C. 509–494 BCE. Written primarily in Elamite, these tablets detail the movement, allocation, and consumption of food across the empire. Most are short and dull to the casual reader, but together they paint a picture of staggering bureaucratic complexity. Sample entries include 20 workers in the cedar forest assigned 1 ka of barley each per day. A woman named Erdabama provides 72 liters of wine to female workers over a 12-day period. 3 donkeys fed 30 liters of barley at Station 19, Royal Road. Each line represents a day in the life of someone forgotten, but also a moment where the empire's promises were kept. Measuring the meal. The empire didn't guess at rations. It standardized them using units like QA, a volume measure for grain or liquid, approx. 0.95 liters. KUR, a larger unit, roughly 180–200 liters. She, a unit of barley, used widely in Mesopotamian systems. QARU, an Achaemenid ration unit, exact value debated. A standard male laborer might receive 1 to 2 qa of barley per day, enough to produce simple gruel or flatbread. Higher-ranked workers received more, along with extras like oil or wine. Women and children received fractional rations, often 1/2 to 1/3 the adult male share. Animals had their own allowances. Donkeys were fed barley, tracked by weight and frequency. Camels, used for long-distance hauling, had more generous feed. Oxen, used in agriculture, were rationed seasonally based on workload. All of this was recorded, down to the last seed. The warehouse network. Where did all this food come from, and where did it go? The empire maintained an extensive system of state-run storehouses. These were located near royal palaces and construction sites, major road junctions, provincial capitals, and administrative centers. Each warehouse had a stock ledger tracking goods in and out, a manager who filed monthly reports, security staff to protect inventory, scribes, of course, who did the counting. Grain was stored in large clay jars or silos. Oil was sealed in amphorae. Meat was salted or dried. Beer was brewed on site or issued as a barley equivalent. At regular intervals, deliveries were made to work sites. A tablet might record. From Warehouse A to Persepolis Gate Project, 400 qa barley, 50 qa wine, 30 qa oil, for use by 120 laborers over 10 days. The system was fluid but controlled. Each transfer was matched with a receipt. Each receipt had a seal. If a scribe misplaced one, it meant an audit. Who received rations? The recipients of food rations included state laborers. These were not slaves, but workers bound to state service. They built roads, temples, and fortifications. Temple personnel. Priests and support staff often received rations in lieu of coin. Temples managed their own allocations, but their books were still inspected by the state. Military garrisons. Soldiers received rations based on unit strength and assignment. Cavalrymen were granted extra for their horses. Couriers and travelers. The royal road included ration stations. Couriers received food for themselves, and their animals recorded carefully at each stop. Dependents. Families of workers often lived on site. Women and children received reduced shares, often managed by female supervisors. There was no universal welfare, but the state did aim to ensure continuity of function. You were fed if your role kept the empire running. Erdabama and the bureaucracy of feeding. One name stands out in the fortification tablets, Erdabama. She was a high-ranking female official, likely a noblewoman, who managed vast estates and distributed rations to hundreds of workers under her control. Her records include grain allocations, wine distributions, payments in oil. She signed with her own seal. She gave orders. She was known in multiple provinces. Erdabama wasn't feeding a village. She was feeding a network of laborers that stretched across regions. She didn't wage wars or give speeches. She distributed barley, and that made her powerful. So tonight, as your thoughts drift into stillness, imagine a storeroom just outside the palace walls. Inside, the smell of grain, the creak of pottery. A man hunched over a tablet, nodding a minor delivery. 18 liters of barley, 6 liters of oil. Another day in a system that never slept. And ask yourself, is it more noble to build an empire or to feed the ones who keep it standing? In the last section, we stood in the storerooms of the Achaemenid Empire, surrounded by amphorae of oil, barrels of grain, and the scratch of styluses on clay. We saw how food wasn't just nourishment, it was infrastructure, the lifeblood of labor, armies, temples, and travelers. Now we follow that barley a little further, not as a meal, but as money. Because in the Achaemenid world, Food wasn't simply handed out for survival, it was a structured, quantified, bureaucratically valued unit. It functioned as currency, payment, and proof of obligation. And in this system, being fed meant being counted. Being unfed meant being outside the empire's care. Let us return to the record room, not the kitchen, and begin again. The empire without coins. Although the Achaemenid Empire minted coins, most famously the gold daric, and the silver siglos coinage, was not the primary medium of exchange across most of the empire. In rural villages, state labor camps, and even satrapal courts, the economy functioned primarily through commodity-based compensation. The state used barley as a base unit, oil, wine, and dates as supplements, meat, wool, or livestock in certain provinces, and in some cases, labor credits to offset taxation. Coins were useful for trade between elites or merchants, but for the masses, food was wealth. A laborer didn't earn silver. He earned a daily grain ration. A craftsman might be paid with a skin of wine or a measure of oil. This wasn't primitive, it was deliberate. Rations by rank. One of the most sophisticated aspects of the Achaemenid rationing system was its attention to rank and role. Not all recipients were treated equally. The system categorized workers into several tiers. Common laborers. Standard issue, QA of barley per day. Occasionally supplemented with dates or oil during seasonal work. Skilled artisans. Received increased barley plus wine or oil. Often given bonus rations for high-output months. Supervisors and overseers. Paid in bulk quantities, sometimes enough to feed an entire household. Allowed to redistribute rations as payment to subordinates. Priests and religious workers. Received ritual allocations tied to religious calendars. Food offerings were part of their income. High officials and estate managers controlled enormous distributions on behalf of the state, used rations to maintain loyalty and workforce stability. Women managing estates like Erdabama distributed rations as both payroll and incentive. We know from surviving tablets that some of her laborers received wine and barley bonuses for seasonal projects. The key wasn't abundance, it was consistency. Every person knew what they would receive, when, and in what measure. Tracking the flow. The most critical part of this system wasn't feeding, it was recording. Every ration, every delivery, every receipt was stamped with a seal indicating authorization. Logged by a scribe, often on duplicate tablets. Cross-checked monthly by warehouse officials. Audited periodically by satrapal agents. One preserved tablet reads, 8th month, year 21 of Darius. From the estate of Parzadani, 160 QA of barley issued to 40 male laborers for the wall project. Duration, 20 days. Verified by Matruya, overseer. That's all. But behind this entry is an entire system. A building project. A food supply line. A team of scribes. A taxation loop. And 40 men who ate because a seal said they could. Food as control. Rations weren't just payment, they were leverage. If a worker failed to meet a quota, his rations might be reduced. If a group completed work ahead of schedule, they might receive a bonus. If a region fell out of favor or into rebellion, ration deliveries could be cut off entirely. There are even suggestions in the Persepolis records of delayed rations being used as disciplinary tools, a subtle, slow form of punishment. No beatings, no prisons, just hunger. This was bureaucratic discipline not imposed by whips, but by ledgers. Feeding non-humans. The Achaemenid bureaucracy was also meticulous in feeding animals not out of compassion, but because animals were infrastructure. Donkeys and camels carried royal messages. Oxen plowed barley fields and hauled construction material. Horses served in cavalry units and ceremonial processions. Each species had an assigned ration profile, depending on size, age, and usage. Donkeys QA barley day. Camels hired due to their size and load. Oxen rationed seasonally, depending on plowing schedules. One tablet notes, to the 3 camels in the northern camp, 96 QA barley, issued over 8 days, verified by Varzana. These animals, too, were part of the empire's accounting. A missed ration meant a missed delivery or a lost beast. Ration days and the calendar. Food distribution also shaped the imperial calendar. In some regions, delivery schedules aligned with Zoroastrian holy days, lunar cycles, or agricultural seasons. The predictability of rations reinforced social rhythm. Villages gathered for barley delivery days, much like modern people do on paydays or holidays. We know of monthly allotments for full-time workers, festival bonuses tied to New Year celebrations, Nowruz, seasonal increases during harvest or construction booms. These events were not merely ceremonial, they were bureaucratically managed. What if the food didn't come? Despite the planning, failures occurred. A late delivery due to storm-flooded roads. A warehouse short on barley. An inventory error that misplaced a shipment. And when that happened, the scribes filed a delay report. They calculated how many mouths were missed. They recorded the deficit. Some regions had reserve stockpiles, precisely for such disruptions. Others filed emergency requests to neighboring satrapies. Even in crisis, the solution was paperwork. One might imagine a worker, hungry after 2 days without rations, walking to the overseer. Where is the barley? It's delayed. What do I do? We filed a report. And so they waited, not for the food but for the approval to eat. So tonight, as your mind softens with the sound of slow grain scooping and seals pressed into wax, imagine a world where hunger and hierarchy were separated only by a tablet, and where fairness meant knowing exactly how much you deserved and when it should arrive. And ask yourself, if you were paid in barley, how much would your life be worth? In our exploration so far, we've walked among storerooms and scribe offices, followed rations from the hand of a clerk to the mouth of a camel, and considered how the Achaemenid Empire fed its workforce not just with food, but with structure, trust, and discipline. But no system lasts forever. In this final section, we turn to what happens when a rationed world begins to falter. Not with fanfare, but with the quiet failure of logistics, missed deliveries, overdrawn warehouses, and the slow realization that you cannot govern an empire on an empty stomach. This is the story of how food bureaucracy failed not all at once, but piece by piece, and how its silence foretold the empire's twilight. The cracks begin, ration shortfalls. Even in its prime, the Achaemenid food distribution system depended on a delicate balance. Predictable harvests, secure transportation, accurate record-keeping, and compliance across hundreds of officials. When one part failed, others soon followed. By the late 5th century BCE, records show signs of stress. Some ration entries appear delayed, with retroactive corrections. Scribes began copying old figures, suggesting missing reports. Regional records noted substitutions, barley exchanged for lesser grains, or oil reduced without explanation. In one rare complaint tablet from Persepolis, a supervisor notes, "The men of the cedar camp went 2 days without barley. Oil ration arrived late and spoiled. Replacement requested." The writing is dry, the tone neutral, but behind it is hunger. A system built to prevent chaos now revealed its own fragility. Missed rations led to absenteeism, which led to halted projects, which led to blame. And still the scribes kept writing. collapse by interruption, war and withdrawal. Much like the census machinery we explored in Story 4, the ration system depended on peace. Roads had to be safe, regions had to be obedient, supply lines had to remain unbroken. As rebellions flared in Egypt, Bactria, and Asia Minor, disruption spread. Storehouses were plundered by rebels or desperate locals. Labor projects were abandoned as workers fled. Horses and camels were requisitioned for war, leaving no transport for food. One entry from a damaged satrapal archive reads, "Rations not received, no caravan from Susa, roads reported unsafe, temple staff unpaid." Even without enemies at the gate, the empire began to unravel from the inside. Bureaucrats wrote reports to administrators who could no longer act. And in the meantime, people went hungry. Silence in the fortification tablets. Archaeologists have long puzzled over a curious pattern. The abrupt disappearance of Persepolis fortification tablets after a certain date shortly before Alexander the Great's arrival in the 330s BCE. It's not clear why the record ends. There's no final entry, no official closure. Some theories include: the system collapsed before Alexander arrived, due to internal decay. The archives were moved or destroyed during the early invasion. Scribes continued to work, but their tablets did not survive. Whatever the cause, the effect is clear. The ledgers go silent. Where there was once a world of numbers, grains, animals, distances, names, there is now absence. And this absence is itself a kind of record. The post-conquest adaptation. Alexander and his successors attempted to revive elements of the Achaemenid system. Some storehouses were repurposed. Local rationing resumed in areas spared by war. Seleucid and Parthian regimes issued food distributions on a smaller scale. But the imperial vision of the Achaemenids, one system, feeding one empire, never returned. The Persian Empire had run on barley and oil the way modern states run on fuel and currency. Once those arteries closed, there was no easy restart. The scribes faded, the seals broke, the storehouses emptied. And the world moved on. A legacy of quiet precision. Yet even in death, the Achaemenid food bureaucracy left behind something profound. Today, in museums and digital archives, the fortification tablets remain among the most detailed administrative records of any ancient civilization. They are not dramatic, they do not tell tales of kings or battles, but they do tell us what people ate, how long they worked, what they were worth in oil and wine, and how even the mightiest empires rest on full bellies. They show us a world where bureaucracy was not red tape, it was lifeline. So now, as your eyes begin to close and your thoughts drift into grain-scented dreams, think of the final day that a warehouse clerk pressed his seal into clay, knowing there was no more barley left to count. And ask yourself, what breaks first when a great system dies: the walls, the will, or the food supply? Story 6, Satraps, Reports, and Royal Eyes. You've heard the term satrap before, probably in a textbook or a passing reference to the provinces of Persia. The word sounds obscure, perhaps decorative, like something left over from a dead language. But in ancient Iran, a satrap was more than a provincial governor. He was the bureaucracy personified. A satrap wasn't merely responsible for collecting taxes or sending troops. He was the node in a vast web of paper trails, clay tablets, seal impressions, messengers, audits, warehouse reports, and agricultural data. And his success or failure depended not on charisma, but on compliance. In this story, we peel back the bureaucratic curtain to explore the internal mechanics of Achaemenid power, the relationship between the center and the periphery, between the great king and his silent eyes in distant provinces. Let us begin with the satrap, not as a title, but as a job description. The origins of the satrap system. The word satrap comes from the Old Persian Kh-shathrapavan, meaning protector of the province. This role existed under earlier Median kings, but it was Darius I.R. 522–486 BCE who systematized it. To govern an empire stretching across 3 continents, Darius divided his realm into approximately 20 satrapies. These were vast territories that could include dozens of cities, hundreds of towns, and thousands of villages. Each satrapy had a capital city with royal garrison and treasury, a network of subordinate officials, district governors, scribes, warehouse keepers, a set tax amount expected to be paid annually, responsibility for law, order, and infrastructure. Satraps were appointed by the king but often drawn from noble Persian families. Many held their office for decades, even across dynastic changes. Their authority was absolute within their borders, except when it was. Because above the satrap stood the only authority that truly mattered, the King of Kings. The flow of reports. At the core of satrapal life was not conquest or ceremony, but reporting. Each satrap was expected to submit regular updates to the central court. These included taxation record, amounts collected in silver, barley, livestock, and goods. Military rosters, numbers of troops, cavalry, available mounts. Construction reports on roads, canals, fortresses. Local unrest, including revolts, famine, or suspicious activity. These were written in Elamite, Aramaic, or Old Persian, depending on region and audience. Some were clay tablets, others were papyrus or parchment scrolls. The satrap scribes compiled them, sealed them, and dispatched couriers usually along the royal road, which had stations every 20–30 kilometers. Speed mattered. A delay in reporting could signal either incompetence or rebellion, and both were punishable. The eyes and ears of the king. The Achaemenid court did not trust its satraps entirely. These men were powerful, wealthy, and often distant from central control. To counterbalance this, the king employed a special class of officials known as the king's eyes and ears. These were imperial inspectors, royal agents who traveled the empire in disguise or secrecy, auditing satraps, investigating complaints, and reporting directly to the king. They arrived unannounced, they inspected accounts, they listened to whispers. And when they found fraud or corruption, they acted swiftly. Several satraps were deposed or executed after negative reports. One surviving source from a Greek historian claims, when a satrap grew too rich, the eyes of the king grew sharper. It wasn't paranoia, it was policy. The satrap's staff, bureaucracy in action. A satrap didn't rule alone. His court was a miniature version of the royal bureaucracy. His team included chief scribes trained in royal formats, responsible for all documentation. Tax officers, who calculated, collected, and forwarded revenues. Messengers and translators. The empire had many languages. Warehouse overseers, tracking goods from grain to armor. Judicial clerks, documenting civil disputes, fines, and punishments. Everything was done in writing. A conversation meant nothing unless it ended with a seal on a document. This was a paper empire, where paper proved power. Satrapal residences and archives. Satraps resided in fortified palaces, often located at strategic crossroads. These palaces included treasuries, where tax revenue was stored before transfer to Susa or Persepolis. Archives, where reports and receipts were meticulously kept. Audience halls, where local petitioners presented requests. In Sardis, Babylon, and Bactria, archaeologists have discovered remnants of these local archives, hundreds of tablets, seal impressions, and administrative tags. Most contain daily inventory checks, delivery records, witness lists for official transactions. Though dusty and repetitive, they show us a world where nothing moved without a record, and where every record moved upward toward the king. The satrap's burden. To be a satrap was not an easy life. Yes, it brought prestige and power, but it also came with constant scrutiny. Fail to meet your tax quota, you might be fined. Delay military support during a rebellion, you might be recalled. Grow too independent, you might be replaced by force. Satraps walked a narrow line between efficiency and obedience. Some walked it well, others fell. So tonight, as your mind drifts through ancient corridors filled with the scratch of reed pens and the rustle of papyrus, picture a lonely satrap seated in his palace, reviewing a pile of documents by lamplight, each one destined for Susa, each one watched by unseen eyes. And ask yourself, what would it feel like to rule if every action required paperwork and every mistake might be your last? Now let us look more closely at the how of administration, because an empire like the Achaemenid one didn't just require strong officials, it required standardized tools, languages, formats, and habits that transformed local facts into empire-wide knowledge. This is the part of history that is almost never told. But it is where real power lived, not in armies, not in laws, but in paperwork that moved with precision from distant provinces to the King of Kings. Let's sit down beside a scribe in Sardis or Bactra, watch his hands, and follow the rhythm of imperial knowledge. Writing across a multilingual empire. One of the first challenges of Achaemenid governance was language. The empire ruled over speakers of Old Persian, Elamite, Akkadian, Aramaic, Greek, Egyptian, Phrygian, Sogdian, and more. No single language could serve the whole. The solution, a layered system of communication. Elamite was often used for internal administration, especially in the Persepolis region. Aramaic, the lingua franca of the Near East, became the dominant language of bureaucratic correspondence. Old Persian was used mainly for royal proclamations, inscriptions, and elite ceremonial records. Local languages were tolerated and sometimes preserved for judicial or cultural use. Satraps relied on translators and multilingual scribes, who could copy a report in Aramaic and provide summaries in Elamite or Greek, depending on who would read it. Imagine it. A single tax document might exist in 3 versions, each identical in content, but shaped for different readers, one for the local court, one for the royal archives, and one for military logistics. What did a report contain? A satrap's reports were not general summaries. They were formulaic, precise, and heavily quantified. A typical monthly report might include population rolls by town or district, harvest data, grain volumes, livestock tallies, tax receipts in silver, produce, and labor, warehouse inventory changes, legal disputes and their outcomes, travel and courier expenses, construction logs, progress measured in manpower days or material use, security notes, arrests, unrest, troop movement. Everything was dated, sealed, and copied. The formulas were standardized. Words like issued, received, certified, and inspected appeared in nearly every document. This uniformity allowed royal clerks to review hundreds of reports quickly, spotting errors or inconsistencies. A missing seal, a misplaced date, a suspicious overestimation. That could prompt an inspection. Tools of the bureaucratic trade. Now, let us observe the physical tools used to build this paper empire. Clay tablets, common in the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia. Used for durable records, legal contracts, inventories, and receipts. Written using a stylus on wet clay, then baked or dried. often sealed with cylinder seals rolled across the surface. Papyrus and leather scrolls, used for correspondence and reports, especially in western provinces like Egypt or Syria. Easier to transport, though more fragile. Ink and brushes or pens, for writing on parchment or papyrus. Ink was made from carbon or gall mixtures. Brushes were made of reed, often trimmed to a fine point. Seals. Every official had a personal or office seal. Pressing a seal into clay or wax authenticated a document. Losing a seal was a disaster. It could mean forgeries or impersonation. Counters and tallies. Officials often used pebbles, tokens, or wax tablets to calculate taxes before formal entry. This was not a romantic vision of history. It was repetitive, cautious, and procedural. But it worked. The courier network. Once a report was written, it had to be delivered. Enter the Royal Postal System, a network of messengers and stations stretching from Susa to Sardis, covering over 2,500 kilometers. Herodotus describes it like this: neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their appointed course. At intervals of 25 to 30 kilometers, relay stations provided fresh horses, food, and sometimes lodging. Each satrapy managed its own segment of the system, ensuring continuity. A monthly report from Egypt could reach Susa in under 2 weeks. Speed was critical. The king had to know what was happening before problems grew. Inspections and revisions. Reports weren't final once they arrived. They were reviewed by central clerks. Discrepancies prompted inquiries. Missed deadlines led to warnings or audits. Reports were often annotated, sent back for revision, or followed up by inspectors. One satrap's misreported grain total led to a full-scale investigation of local warehouse records. Another satrap was accused of undercounting troops to hide desertions. His military scribes were interrogated and dismissed. The system didn't require perfection, but it demanded honesty within limits, or at least the appearance of it. Conflicts within the paper trail. Satraps were not always obedient servants. Many grew ambitious and sometimes corrupt. Some common forms of manipulation included falsified reports, inflating taxes collected to cover up personal siphoning, delayed submissions to avoid scrutiny or buy time during a local crisis, ghost labor, reporting non-existent workers to draw extra rations, seal fraud, using a lower official seal to escape responsibility. These were countered by duplicate records, one sent to the capital, one kept at a separate district office, cross-regional audits, using rotating teams to prevent local bias, inquisitions, direct interventions from royal emissaries. A satrap could cheat, but only for so long. Eventually, a missing barley shipment or a duplicate tax receipt might bring the entire scheme to light. So tonight, as the candle dims on your desk and your thoughts settle like dust on a ledger, imagine yourself as a clerk in a far-flung province, reviewing a final report one more time. Is the grain count accurate? Are the names spelled correctly? Will the king's eyes believe you? You fold the scroll, seal it, dispatch it into the silence of the night, and ask yourself, can a system built on paper truly hold together the weight of an empire? We've followed the careful crafting of reports, the translation of facts into numbers, and the movement of documents across a continent. We've seen satraps held in check by royal inspectors and the fear of missing seals. But now, we turn to the other side of the story. What happens when the paperwork is perfect, but the loyalty is gone? This final section looks at the slow erosion of control, not due to inefficiency or ignorance, but due to ambition. Because even in the most meticulous bureaucracies, people are not machines. They bend the rules, obscure intentions, and sometimes they rebel. When the system depends on paper, power often lies in those who hold the pen. The quiet rebellion of the satrap. In a perfect world, the satrap was the king's extension. His eye, his ear, his arm. But in reality, many satraps were rulers in all but name. They commanded troops, collected taxes, controlled roads and storehouses, issued orders under their own seal. And for years, sometimes decades, satraps passed their offices down like inheritance. One of the most notable examples was Pisistratus, satrap of Lydia in the 5th century BCE. His rule was long and largely compliant until it was. When he supported a rebellion against the Persian king, it wasn't a battlefield decision, it was a logistical one. He had the resources, treasury funds, loyal troops, and the knowledge of how the imperial system worked, including its weaknesses. His reports still arriving, his seals still intact. By the time Susa realized the truth, he was already defending a fortified revolt. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but not before it forced the central administration to rethink one of its oldest assumptions: that paperwork equals obedience. False compliance. Some satraps learned a more dangerous lesson: how to maintain the illusion of loyalty. Instead of open rebellion, they underreported taxable goods, manipulated population counts, delayed the recruitment of soldiers, used their scribes to forge compliance. A satrap might present a perfect tax record while quietly stockpiling resources for private use. One might underreport troop numbers to the king while fielding an unofficial militia. Another might stage false audits to discourage royal interference. Because in an empire ruled by reports, the most powerful man was often the one who decided what got written down. The king's countermove: divide and watch. The Achaemenid kings were not naive. They understood the risks of decentralization, so they implemented several strategies to curb satrapal overreach. Separate civil and military authority. In some regions, the general of the army reported directly to the king, not the satrap. Rotating inspectors. The king's eyes were drawn from loyal families and sent without warning. Intersatrapal competition. Satraps were encouraged to monitor one another. A letter of complaint from one satrap about another was taken seriously. Strategic appointments. The king might assign a satrap's son to a distant satrapy, splitting family power. These tactics did not always succeed, but they created a climate of mutual suspicion, which kept potential traitors cautious. Bureaucracy versus trust. In the end, the empire's bureaucracy could only go so far. It could record, count, compare, seal, and dispatch, but it could not guarantee loyalty. The satraps were too distant, the empire was too vast, and ambition was too human. And yet, remarkably, the system endured for over 2 centuries, not because it was perfect, but because it was self-correcting. Rebellions were rare, not because the paperwork was flawless, but because the consequences of failure were so severe. To be caught falsifying a report wasn't a clerical error, it could mean execution. To hoard taxes meant risking your entire family. So the bureaucracy worked not by trust, but by fear and frequency. The end of the satrapal era. With the invasion of Alexander the Great in 330 BCE, the satrap system underwent rapid transformation. Some satraps defected to the Macedonians, offering local control in exchange for favor. Others resisted hopping to retain Achaemenid traditions. Alexander adopted the system at first, but began to replace Persian satraps with Macedonian officials and eventually centralized power around his own court. The balance between local autonomy and imperial oversight, so carefully maintained by Darius and his successors, was broken. In the end, the Achaemenid Empire did not fall because the paperwork failed. It fell because, at some point, the people writing the report stopped believing in the system they were maintaining. So tonight, as your thoughts drift among crumbling archives and half-finished scrolls, imagine a satrap sitting at his desk for the final time. His seal is ready, his report complete, but in his mind a decision. Send it to Susa, or seal it for himself. And ask yourself, can you truly govern an empire if all you ever receive is what your governors want you to see?